Oh my God!
Hey everybody, it's Sunday night. It's not Thanksgiving yet. It's not even net neutrality time, although that's coming. And if you're wondering what you showed up to, and you're probably wondering, this is hashtag SPSM. I've got the wrong camera on. This is the suicide prevention social media chat. I am at Doc Foreman, your intrepid moderator. We're going to be talking about some very interesting sort of speculative data science tonight and some interesting digital signals in your credit score and how actuarial lists, those are people, they're actual people, are already learning a lot about your behavior and your mental health by looking at your financial data, and probably suicidologists could do the same, but you know, it's your credit score, so it's complicated. We're going to be talking about that tonight, and we're going to be talking about conversations that have been had over the course of about a year. Do I look like an actuarialist or anybody who knows anything about finances? Obviously not. I'm sitting in my dining room with a discount curtain behind me. But I have some people here who are going to help us out. Everybody, Mr. Tony Wood.
Hey everybody, the only thing I know is that actuarialist is not a word.
It's not.
I think that you may have combined aerialist, which would be the man in the flying trapeze, with an actuary, which I would like these two professions to be the same. Because it seems fair that people who are super good at math who work for insurance companies also are really good at the flying trapeze.
It is entirely
Hashtag
possible.
Flying Willindas.
But most people, much like that Ben Stiller, Jennifer Aniston movie, most people who are interested in insurance and predicting risk are not trapeze artists, interestingly enough. And we'll talk about why. But before we get to that, Dr. Bart Andrews.
Hey, greetings everybody in SPSM land. April's making up new words. We're in the middle of November. I'd call this mid-November. Wouldn't you agree? Can I get a consensus on this? Is technically mid-November?
Yeah.
It's in the middle. If it's the
It's
2nd
mid-November.
or the 29th.
It is. Yeah, I think so. I've got a lot of wiggle room. Mid-November gives us a lot of wiggle room. It's a forgiving middle of the month. I think most people would agree with that. Excited to be on the show. I'm excited that we're talking about how big data and actuarial data and how credit scores and all of this stuff fits in with risk prediction, because I have a lot of thoughts on that, which will be shocking. I want to give a big shout out to Anne-Marie Matulis, who has helped. This is a big deal because BHR, where I work, a groovy little crisis line in St. Louis, Missouri, which has been working with Mercy Health and the St. Louis NAMI chapter to create a support group and educational program for friends, family members, loved ones of people who are fighting suicide attempt survivors, people who are fighting thoughts of suicide. And if you guys didn't know this, there's not a lot of resources out there for people who are trying to support loved ones in their life who are fighting suicide. Anne-Marie created a really cool workshop, and she helped us blend that in to a program that we're doing here in St. Louis, and we've actually had our first month of doing that, and it's going amazingly well. And I'm hoping that we're going to see more and more programs like this. So thank you, Anne-Marie. And let's talk about actuaries, because nothing says excitement like actuary. I mean, most people, when you even say the word actuary, instantly just no, it's not. It's pretty boring. Okay.
Yeah, I know, totally. And people are going to be like, why would you do a show on this? And then afterwards, they're going to be like, this could be life-changing. And I'm not
people's
even
defense,
kidding.
they ask us that a lot, April. So I don't think I don't think that's specific to this show. I think a lot of times people are like, why did you do a show on that?
Why? And everybody, Mr. Chris Maxwell.
Hey everybody, I'm Chris Maxwell. Like April just said, I work for the largest national suicide prevention hotline in the country. And I also co-chair the strategic media response task force for the American Association of Suicidology. I'm extremely excited to talk about these really important and really critical topics tonight. Just coming from the crisis center background that I have, and personally speaking to so many people who call crisis lines to talk about some of their really big issues with finances, and how it affects their daily life and how it affects their quality of life. I think this is obviously something that has been a really big impact on people since forever, but especially since the 2008 economic crash. And so I'm thrilled that we're going to be talking about this tonight.
And I want to let you know that we've got a lot of wonderful people in the house. Meg Stone's in the house. Of course, Anne Marie's in the house. Noreen's in the house. Zing is in the house. And he tweeted with a few extra Twitter characters a joke. An actuary, an underwriter, and an insurance salesman are riding in a car. The salesperson has his foot on the gas. The underwriter has his foot on the brake. And the actuary is looking out the back window telling them where to go. And then there is a GIF. You'll have to go on Twitter under #SPSM to find out how funny that is. This is one of those deals where it's a little inside nerd. I'm just going to let you know, and I want to talk to you about some conversations that I had that sort of led to this. So one of the really cool things about my life the last couple of years has been that I've got to meet people in various forms of technology and science sectors to talk about the problem of suicide and talk about the problems of assessing risk and predicting them and the problems of scale and talking about different ways that we might approach them. And one of the things that we're talking about are digital signals. And if you have followed SPSM for very long, I mean, you've heard us talking about digital signals and things like people's language, their social media posts, their digital behaviors. There are some things that I can't talk about, but there are some interesting signals in a lot of the devices that you use every day. So even, you know, these wireless ear pods that I'm wearing create a digital signal about when I wear them and what I listen to and how often. And we were looking at, and I've been looking at all kinds of digital signals that might provide information about behavior and information about suicide risk. One of the things that you might know, if you've watched this show for very long, is that Dr. Craig Brine has done some groundbreaking research saying that suicide risk is fluid and that it fluctuates very rapidly, especially heading up to an attempt or death. And so we think, in fact, that we need high-frequency signals about behavior if we want to predict a death attempt or an attempt or a death, like at a point in time. So think about this like, well, like getting diagnosed with cancer. You would have things that might tell you what your risk of cancer is, and that may be lifestyle factors, genetics, exposure to radiation. Like if these things happen, you've got this sort of lifetime risk of cancer. Then we might have screens to see if you are in fact on the way to developing cancer or have developed cancer. And then we even have ways of testing to see sort of what stage or what the progression of the cancer is. And those things can inform, you know, what levels of intervention you need to do and things like that. But we really, in a lot of ways for mental illness, we really don't have that sort of way of looking at most of these phenomena, in especially related to suicide. Now, Bart, I bet, is going to disagree with me, and maybe Chris and Tony, about is it useful to predict or to assess risk? Is it useful to predict possibly a death? But the question is, can we do it? And in fact, what we think is that there are people in other fields, and actuaries? Why do I want them to be aerialists? I don't know what that is, but we think that actuaries may have another piece of that. And you know, what happens is I meet people because they have watched the show or heard of it for crazy reasons. And so I'm sitting around talking to a bunch of people, and I said, you know, we hear that financial triggers are really strongly associated with suicide attempts or deaths. And we know that people have changes in financial circumstances leading up to suicide attempts and deaths. And it isn't, you know, I wish that there was a signal for that. And I said, well, there is. There's your credit score, and there's a bunch of other stuff. And Chris, you mentioned the financial crisis of 2008, so I'm going to hand the mic to you. Let's talk a little bit about why we believe that there is a link between finances and suicide attempts and deaths.
So one of the things in one of the larger articles that you sent over when we first started talking about this was making a big distinction between risk for suicide and types of things that are happening in someone's life. So circumstances based on either external factors or more inner factors, or even interpersonal factors. And when it came down to the 2008 economic crash, you see a lot of people who are already in their, I don't remember what the age range is. It's the middle age range, 40 to 65, who is put together. Factor unexpectedly takes everything away from them. So this very harsh and this very rushed circumstance basically just demolishes their livelihood and their quality of life. And those factors are sometimes associated with more violent means of suicide attempts, and they're also attached to those kind of more impulsive behaviors. At least that's what this research was talking about. But so I think what was really a big concern is that with that group of people already, that middle-aged group, you have the predisposition to be affected by these unpredictable circumstances, and something like this comes along and affects people on a wide scale, and everybody is going through it, and everybody's dealing with it, and they're all dealing with it in certain ways. You have the people who are dealing with it in not the best ways, who potentially stop paying mortgages to pay something else, or hide things from their spouses, or hide things from their kids. And so when those things kind of start stacking on top of the already bad circumstances that have happened externally, now you have these interpersonal factors that are coming in too. It's all just, when we think about suicide risk in general and risk factors and warning signs, we talk about this stacking feature. And when it gets to a point where things start toppling over, that's when people are at the highest risk. And so when you have all this kind of combining, especially in economic sense, it gets really dangerous for a lot of people.
Yeah, in fact, some of the research that we looked at when we were getting ready for the show, and this is linked in the blog, so I hope that you'll go check this out, because this is like much research. All of this is in, we need to fund it, needs a lot of replication, and looking at these data sets is very hard to do. But when we looked at like the Asian financial crisis of 1997, or we look at the Great Recession of 2008 or the Great Depression, we see people who are dying by suicide that did not appear to be at risk prior to a big financial collapse, or that there's something about the stress of a collapse that seems to have caused an increase in deaths sort of all on its own, like as its very own risk factor. And there's sort of debate about like what are the biopsychosocial causes of that. And then we also see another sort of effect. This is sort of a chicken egg item. We see that there are folks with various kinds of mental health issues that spending and finances really do sort of predict declines in mental illness. And sometimes you'll see disruptions or changes in people's spending and budgeting and financial habits in advance of very severe deterioration of mental health, like in the case of bipolar disorders. Very interestingly enough, and I don't mind sharing this. So some of you know that my husband was diagnosed with thyroid cancer, but sort of going into that, he had some weird behaviors, and some of them were about spending like small amounts of money with a couple of credit cards we didn't use, and then sort of forgetting about it. Things that had not happened ever. And there's some weird sort of changes like that that are very trackable. Your credit scores are very sensitive to. And we know that folks who, like, we know that, and actuarialists know that changes in these really complex financial data tend to predict things like dying in a car accident, or what years you're most likely to have a car wreck. And so if you imagine that your spending habits predict when you'd be in a car accident, that's kind of weird, but very supportable mathematically. Now, this is where we start to get into some creepy issues. Now, I know that Bart likes having people track things about him online, right?
I do? When did I say that? I don't really know. When have I said that? Have I ever actually said that? Are you being sarcastic? Oh, okay.
No, I'm a very straight shooter, Bart. The truth is that you really like a lot of digital transparency about yourself, and a lot of people having a lot of access to your data, right? And spying on you.
No, no, I don't like it. So I think that there's a lot of stuff wrapped up into this, and there's a lot of things. And actually, Amber made a comment as I was reading through all of the information that you sent out. One of the things that we currently are doing around data, and this is something that the data scientists will tell you, is that we think that when we're using algorithms that we're eliminating discrimination and prejudice and bias. And in fact, what we find out, in fact, is that our algorithms actually carry the very biases that we're trying to eliminate using algorithms. And one of the things when I was looking at the data is that a lot of the things that they're describing are things that are connected also to poverty. Right?
Mm-hmm.
And so there's actually a lot of research coming out about how cognition is different in folks that are impoverished or who are living in with less resources. It actually changes the way that the brain works, and they tend to be more focused on immediate needs, not long-term goals, right? So we have this incredible thing when you look at these models, we're charging people more who have poor credit ratings, which is really quite ironic, isn't it? That these are the folks that already can't afford to pay their bills, that are already struggling financially. And now we're saying, oh, and we're going to charge you even more money. It's kind of like right now we have a problem in this country where people are arrested, they're fined, they're poor, they can't pay their fines, and then we actually keep them in jail because they can't pay their fines, right? So we actually punish people for being poor. So when I see data like this, I start getting really nervous that we're in a way perpetuating the tremendous level of grief and persecution against folks that have less money than other people. Right? I mean,
it could be used improperly, although we don't have any evidence that that's what's happening or that it will necessarily happen. It could be, and we'll talk about that because it could be that you could get charged more for your insurance if they determined you were at greater risk.
Well, here's what's interesting. The article said that there's 2 states, Massachusetts and California, that don't allow the use of credit reporting in insurance.
There are 9.
Oh, there's 9. The one article said 2. So what's really interesting is what they didn't say is, are the insurance companies in California and Massachusetts making less money because they can't use this method? Are they at a deficit? They didn't address that. So it's interesting to me that, and here's my favorite part, they said that the decision was made, are you ready? A deliberate decision was made by legislators and regulators that this was a fine thing to do. Here's my little thing. I don't want legislators and regulators deciding what's discriminatory and not, because in this country, our legislators and regulators tend to be, not so good at making decisions about what's best for the rest of us. So I find that really interesting.
So Bart, can you really respond? Someone said, is there a higher instance of suicide among those in poverty? Who has that data? Can people on the panel talk about, when we do analysis of suicide attempts and deaths, that financial and relationship stressors are 2 of the number 1 and 2 things, right?
So, I mean, it's a really interesting, the relationship between a suicide and financial status is incredibly complicated, like suicide behavior in general. And you can find research that both shows that suicide rates are higher in folks in lower income areas. You can find data that shows that, in fact, suicide risk goes up with economic status. In fact, I was just part of an article that an actuary actually did around this, who showed some great research that showed in the insurance that they have, the risk of suicide increases as you go up in the quartiles of income. So where things get really complicated is that these are reductionistic approaches, right? Where we try to explain a behavior by these static categories. And what they don't account for is 2 things. 1, your financial status relative to other people's financial status. So there's some data that suggests that poverty is more associated with suicide when people who are impoverished have more contact and are around people who have a lot more than them, right? So when there's a relative difference in income, lower income tends to be predictive of suicide. The other thing that we tend to see is that rapid or pending changes in economic status impact the suicide rate. So we've got these dynamic emergent factors that a lot of the data kind of covers up, because we're not seeing that fluidity in these very often these big broad attempts we use to try to explain poverty and suicide, or being rich and suicide, when in fact it's layered and it's dynamic, and it's about what your status relative to other people and changes in economic status. So I think that's really key, and the data is very supportive of the change in economic status being a major risk factor.
So thank you for addressing that question. I just want to just circle back on one thing you said, which is in the 9 states where they are just legally disallowed from using credit score data in developing the actuary models for risk, and ideally in a fair world, what would happen is that people with more risk have to pay higher premiums, but your premiums are tied to that level of risk so that it sort of is mathematically fair across risk categories, that you're only paying for the amount of risk that you bring to the pool that you're being insured with. But in fact, what we might do is assign people at higher risk quite a lot higher premiums. And we might do some unfair assigning of that. And we might use credit score data to make people pay more for insurance. And that was sort of why those laws are there. So instead, and this was directly pointed out in some of the things we linked in the SPSM blogs. We did a little bit of, we've been working with folks and talking about this for about a year. What they're wanting to do is they're wanting to scrape social media. Your credit score really is made out of hundreds of different data factors, or hundreds of different factors, right? It's like 450 or something like that. It's actually fairly complex. And people can get at that, and they can actually, of those hundreds of factors that go into a credit score, they can pull out subsets that represent different kinds of actuarial risk. They can run that data, or they can do research on that. They just can't do peer-reviewed research on that for reasons. And that also bothers me, which is that people are figuring these things out, but they're often not getting published in journals. And they can just do social media scraping and find a social media data signal that hits at the same thing. And they can just use that and just not use your credit score, but basically do the same thing, Bart. They'll just get around it. Tony, you're making Tony face.
Well, it's kind of like, well, why lock your doors when they can just bust your window in? You know, I think that logic is just incredibly flawed to me. It's like, hey, if something's friggin' wrong, then don't friggin' do it. And if they're going to do something else, then let's find a way to make sure that they're doing that appropriate, rather than say, well, they're going to do this one way or the other. Let's just go ahead and roll with it. So I think that's the way that I think about it. So the question, and this is what's really key, we don't really understand really well with these big financial institutions, like insurance companies, which now insurance companies can be banks, and banks can be credit card companies, and everybody can be everything.
And cats can be dogs.
Cats absolutely can be dogs, and they can sell you insurance, hold your money, and give you a credit card. All these things are getting wrapped up. This corporate concentration is an extremely real problem, and so these folks, a fewer and fewer number of folks, have greater and greater control. And one of the ways they control us is through our data, and we have. Whoa. I think did I bail on you? Did we lose April or me?
Froze up.
That was weird. So anyway, so I think that one of the things that's really important to me is that as we move into the era of big data, the general consumer is really divorced from all of these things that are happening. And we have no idea. That's why shows like this are so important that we're talking about, because people have no idea how these things are being decided, how these prices are being determined. And that means when we're clueless, when we're ignorant, we're defenseless against it. So that's why these conversations are so important.
With that in mind, one of the things when we looked at, one of the major academic things that we shared in the blog was a 20-page actuarial article going over how they very clearly used financial signals to predict behaviors, and they related it like in a really great way. Like you could have published this in a psych journal, to different psychology theories, to different kinds of behaviors, and said this isn't just sort of a data artifact, but the reason that your financial data seems to predict risk is that it was sensation seeking, impulsivity, and it would predict things like, well, how likely are you to have done routine maintenance in your car? How likely are you to run a red light? How likely are you? And so they could predict when you had changes in credit score, they think that there were changes in anxiety, stress, impulsivity, being overwhelmed. You might have more bills or things that got unpaid. You might have lost a job. And so there seemed to be more sort of chaos, and credit score changes may be showing early on these sort of invisible stressors that are happening to people before you sort of find out how bad it is, sort of down the road when someone's coming in.
I admit that I, like the audience, did not read ahead. So
okay.
I did not read the homework assignment. So the question
You were on the chat. We were preparing.
People get busy. There's distractions.
You went to book fair.
What were you doing? Yeah, what were you doing, Tony? What were you doing today, Tony?
I could have been. Well, I was at an antiquarian book fair.
What?
I was at the annual antiquarian book fair in Boston, Massachusetts.
Antiquarian book. Well, the hijinks must have ensued at that.
It's crazy. It's a wild party down at the antiquarian book fair.
Well, we were at home reading an actuarial journal, so
yeah, you know. So the question that I have for you is: did they predict it or did they detect it?
That's a good point.
I don't know why that's important. Tell us more.
Well, prediction is where you can see the future, and detection is where you can see what happened after it happened.
So that is a really, really good point.
Which is why Zinger's joke is funny this much.
We love you, Zing.
Zinger, I'm sure would be great. I don't.
In the actuarial article, they talked about predicting risk of a car wreck using changes in credit scores. And that if the credit score changed, your risk of a car wreck in the year following was going to go up. And so they were predicting changes in risk, which is not predicting when you would have a car accident, but saying that we believe in the next year your likelihood of a car accident is going up. So we're going to have to raise your premium.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Does that make sense?
Statistical models are tricky, everybody.
This is complicated math.
Well, and so imagine. So let's take the scenario of a married woman with 3 kids whose husband has financial problems, runs up the credit, destroys the credit, leaves the house. Right now, you've got a mom who's got to find work. She's got 3 kids. Her credit is trashed. Her insurance rates now go up because her credit is bad because we deem to be her higher risk. So now someone who has less money through no fault of her own is thrown into this pool because the pool of folks with this credit rating are potentially at higher risk, right? So this is where big data gets really scary.
Yes.
Right.
And insurance, car insurance, and health insurance quotes.
Well, I want you all to know that while we love the term, that everybody loves the term big data, and it's become
not everybody. That's not true.
Everybody's become very excited about it. They either hate big data or they love big data or they think there could be more big data. Big data, big data, big data. There is no big data. There's only statistics.
There's no big data?
There is no big data. I mean, there is big data. I mean, big data exists, but it's not what's bandied out. It's bandied about to be statistics. So
when you say there's no big
How
data,
to Lie with Statistics.
Explain what you mean. When you say there's no big data, what do you mean?
The term big data is tossed around so much until it's become meaningless. It's become sort of a meaningless aphorism about like, oh, that's big data, giant data analysis. For example, the work that Quantify does on suicide ideation and behavior.
And I'm not laughing at that. I'm laughing at Zing. Sorry. Keep going.
Data. It's all little data because, thank goodness, the death rate from suicide is a very low base rate event in the general population. So we are talking about tiny numbers of people in segments in the population that we lose to suicide every year in comparison to, say, heart disease or cancer, which are much bigger.
But my understanding
tiny data problems.
My understanding is we can even use, from what I understand, changes in financial data and changes in credit score to predict things like risk of a heart attack in the next year.
I think it's possible. I don't think there's any reason to believe that. I think we can all imagine simple markers that would increase your risk for heart disease. But
a heart attack.
What you're eating out, you don't pay a gym membership. You don't pay copays at the doctor. You can imagine simple things in your financial data that might be predictors of your risk of a heart attack.
And that is exactly like what could be interesting, is that this common piece of data, like this common digital signal that everyone, like there, and of course Equifax, let's talk about having that hacked then, that everyone pretty much has, could be complex enough. And, you know, because I get my sort of credit score like automatically sent to me all the time, right? And if there's any change up or down or whatever, it lets me know, and there's a graph, right? And it tells me things like that data that I'm already paying, you know, to get a report on, like that could be telling me about my risk of getting in a car accident, having a heart attack, developing a life-threatening illness, or becoming at risk of suicide.
Sure. I mean, but that's what insurance has been doing since almost the beginning of since it was a thing.
Why are more actuarialists coming to AAS then?
Well, they don't need to, because they've got their own way of looking at this stuff. But there's a couple of things we need to clarify. One, they're not actually predicting your behavior, April. They're looking at a group that's similar to you, and they're hedging their bets that people who belong in this group are more likely to engage in this behavior, and so they pool that. So in fact, if you don't have an accident, which you might not, you're discriminated against because you belong to this category that you may have had no choice in belonging to in the first place. And this is one of the things where we really get at the heart of discrimination, right? Where you are in fact treated differently because of a group that you belong to that you can't do a damn thing about, right? And doesn't necessarily predict you specifically, but because of people who have a similar trait as you are more likely to have this thing happen. Right? We're gonna charge you more money.
Now I could, for example, get, you know, insurance through a different now it's not easy to do, but I could not drive a car, get insurance through a different company, move to a state where it's not allowed. You know, it won't be forced on you. So buying insurance and paying the premiums is a choice, but you're totally right. And one of the reasons that in 9 states this is banned is that there is very serious concern that credit scores are impacted by things like, you know, Amber Cannon and other people are mentioning, like a woman's credit score when she's a victim of domestic violence and leaves her partner, like flees for her life, her credit score may tank.
Yep.
And so she might get charged more. And if folks who are doing premium rates for life insurance start saying, well, you're at greater risk of killing yourself, so we're going to charge you more for life insurance.
Well, I mean, I think that, you know, not to defend the insurance industry, because they're a really hard industry to defend, but the basis of what insurance is that you pay a little bit your part to protect against the risk of this X thing. Originally, fire insurance your house was going to burn down, your business was going to burn down. You pay a little bit of money so that if your house burns down, then the insurance company will pay you a lot of, you know, bundled together money from all the other people that paid insurance so that you could rebuild your business. It's a way of spreading risk across groups. And this math that says, oh, you're at higher risk, so you've got to pay more, that's not exactly unfair. You know, like if you are a fireworks company, you should offer fire insurance.
But you've chosen to be in a fire insurance company, right? So there's different levels here. So and this is really important. April's pointing out, well, you can choose to live into a different state. You can't just pick up and move to a different state because
I did not, like, please don't categorize as meaning that glib, because I'm saying, in fact, that's not like that choicy, but the argument is. The argument is that, it's a bad argument. My argument.
It's not my argument. You've distanced yourself from a bad argument, which is always a good idea, by the way. So one, you're required by law to have car insurance. You've got to have, most people in this day and age, unless you live in a city with really good public transportation, you've got to have a car to have a job, right? You've got to have insurance to drive. And then now you're subject to these rules and these algorithms that we don't really understand really well. Now, John Ackerman asked a really good question about, hey, can we reduce suicide behavior with actuarial data, which is a great question.
Yes, and I want to talk about Equifax.
Let's talk about Equifax. I was just saying, let's do it.
So the actuarialists are saying it's this credit score, it's this financial data, but your actuarial data is good, but also this credit score data. And so the answer is, like, think about, I like to when I'm helping folks with a chronic mental health like disorder or various ones that probably they're going to manage for the rest of their life. So it's a lot more like I'm helping someone who has type 1 diabetes, where there's going to be management of insulin, testing your blood sugar, you know, determining what adjustments we've got to make, understanding that things are going to change as you age, all that stuff. And that we've just got to be watching it all the time and then sort of responding to changes in your health. It could be, now this is an adjust world, and Bart is 100% correct. We don't live in a just world in a lot of ways, and people can do shady things. But that you could opt as part of your credit score rating, or you could say, like, if one of the Equifax or TransUnion services or whatever that you could use is tell me my risk of having a major health incident or my risk of suicide changing based on changes in my credit score. Because remember, your credit score, even though you're getting one number, is actually made out of hundreds of numbers, and subsets of those seem to be related to behavior. What if somebody figured out what that was, and just like I get a report in my email box, credit score is doing, and to pay attention to see if somebody's, you know, I started doing this, I'm a federal employee, and I got hacked by the Chinese, and my identity got stolen. And this is when I started really monitoring everything closely to let me know if someone was opening an account or doing anything with my name or my credit, right? Well, you could be having that same kind of monitoring of that data to give you feedback, and you could opt in, which would be more ethical.
But you pay for it.
What do you think, Bart? Yeah, but I pay for it, my $14.95 a month or a quarter or whatever it is. I think I could get it free through the feds, but it's a service that's offered.
I think that's great, and I think that you're opting in, and people are paying to actually get information that already belongs to them, right? That they're already using for their own delightfully.
The data belongs to me. Getting the information out of it is something I'm paying people to do.
Yeah, but
the data and the information are not the same. Tony, back to girl on this.
I fully agree. You can't. I mean, a big giant data set, which my data personally is, is pretty much useless to me. If you give me all my old social media data in a big database, I can't do much with it. The magicians, which Glenn Coppersmith hates statistics and magic to ever be equated. So if he ever sees this, he's gonna hate it. But the magicians at Quantify have the ability to do things with it, and so but they have to be paid. Trust me, every day every 2 weeks they get.
They make you send them, rock stars and ramen noodles.
Yeah,
well, so I think the people, they're already making money off of our data. First of all, they're friggin' everybody Facebook is making money off of my data. Now, this, to Tony's point, because we've had this conversation before. Well, my individual data isn't that valuable because it's just my data. But that actually is it's inaccurate, because that's like saying, well, one soldier's life in a war that's killed, that life didn't matter because we actually need a million soldiers to fight a war, right? So that one life isn't that important, is it? No, that's what you're saying. You're saying that
we're punting to Maxwell. Maxwell hasn't said anything because we're not even
Maxwell's just staring into the screen while we scream at each other.
Well, he should.
Maxwell, bail us out.
What? Huh?
Yeah, he was at the antiquary. He went to the antiquary book fair in his mind, I think, on that one. That's where he was at.
What have you been noticing?
So one of the things that, like, I love John's question. I love John. Let's just start there. But secondly, his question's amazing.
Well,
and that, like, it really kind of brings us back down to what we're trying to figure out, right? Like, what the hell are we even doing with any of our data if it's not being used to actually stop suicides? One of the articles that we were looking at in their conclusion section, because I didn't read the data section, but in the conclusion section, they had one of their main.
One that struggled through the whole damn thing.
I think you are.
Okay.
There's a really awesome part about biomarkers and neurological factors. Like, they go into norepinephrine and a few other really cool things. So do go and check out the whole thing if you have like an afternoon or a week. So the thing that one of these articles mentioned, one of the recommendations was that And again, this isn't something that's necessarily scalable, but it's something that companies and institutions can implement rather easily. When you and they made an argument that when people get in trouble, or if they're in some sort of disciplinary situation, that those kinds of circumstances, those kinds of unexpected things that cause big stresses, those can be kind of mitigated by having somebody talk about how that might affect them going forward and start talking about suicide as a potential risk. So we can take that from a judicial sense, a judicial setting, and an argument can be made as to whether or not like jails have appropriate measures put in place to keep people from killing themselves. But if you are at a job and you get fired, part of the separation techniques that this company can use is to have somebody come in and talk to you about your mental health and what this might mean for your economic sense going forward, and ways that they can reach out to certain organizations that can help with things like credit scores, all this kind of stuff. It also made me think of suicide in schools. There's a section in there about when kids get in trouble.
Dr. Jonathan Singer. Sorry.
Right, because we haven't talked about him enough tonight. So there is a part in there talking about how one of the recommendations they have is to, if a child gets in disciplinary trouble, to at that point head that off and start talking to them about their mental health and what this might do for them at that point, what the consequences might do, whether or not suicide might be something that they're going to have to deal with or they're thinking about or whatever. So there are instances where we have major life changes where we can actually put people in those situations and try to prepare them, try to educate them, I think. And it's, again, it's not like hugely scalable, but I think it would be a really nice step to see some of these places start doing these things.
We're all answering John's question, and I think there's also probably just this one other piece, which is one of the articles that we cited in the blog. There was a lot there, because this was sort of the expert wasn't coming onto the show. This is a concept we've been working on for a while, and we've been talking to other experts about. Was the idea that we could be looking at financial changes and economic changes and predicting changes in suicide rates and being prepared from a public health perspective. So if we know we're going, we knew when the financial crisis, when the banking crisis hit in 2008.
Yeah.
We were all there. It like happened sort of all at once, right? So when those things are on the horizon, probably the public health folks need to start putting the resources in place for people who are going to be most impacted or whose risk is going to be elevated. I mean, that's another thing that we could do. We could do population health. We could do opt-in individual monitoring. Think of what we could do.
So I think that for those of us that did our reading, and Singer lumped me in with the Maxwell and Tony crowd on this, and I'm distancing myself from the antiquated book club in your mind, didn't do my homework group. So one, the aspect of finances involved in suicide, the American myth, and this is very prevalent in America, that suicide is caused by mental illness. That's the biggest bunch of bullshit ever to be created and fabricated. And I've got huge challenges with that meme. It's damaging. But to John's question, what are insurance companies doing about suicide? They actually are doing some stuff. For instance, there's a great paper about how most life insurance policies, you have a 2-year restriction period where suicide is not covered in the first 2 years of your policy, right? What the data shows, and this is fascinating, the suicide rate doubles at the 2-year mark, doubles in the first month once those insurance policies no longer have the restriction on suicide not covering, right? So insurance companies are, yeah, so in other words...
Wait just a minute. Cover that again. There was a lot of the circular stuff in there.
So in other words, there's a 2-year period after you buy life insurance where a suicide death is not covered.
Right.
In the first month following the lapse of that restriction, once that restriction is no longer present in that first month, so between 2 years and 2 years and 1 month.
25.
Month 25, the suicide rate doubles.
Oh.
In that cohort. the suicide, and it drops down a little bit, but it stays elevated. It stays elevated after that period, right? So they're attending to this. So they're looking at, what do we do about this? We've actually had calls. My crisis line has had calls from insurance companies where they've gotten a call from somebody, and the person has asked, does my policy cover suicide? Insurance companies actually will reach out and try to get help for folks. They're also looking at, what can we do, and exploring, what can we do about this bump? There's clearly this bump. How do we either not insure these folks? Is the insurance increasing the likelihood they'll kill themselves, right? Or what preventive measures can we do? And we actually came up with some solutions, like maybe at the end of that restriction, your insurance company often requires you to get drug tested and a physical before you get life insurance, particularly as you get older. Maybe at that 2-year mark, you have to have an evaluation to make sure you're okay and that everything's okay. So there's a lot of things that we can do with that data, and they're looking at that, right? Because there's clearly this big extreme bump up when that policy no longer has the suicide restriction in it.
I wonder if, when I've worked with folks in recovery for various kinds of, very serious impairments in their mental health, like then sort of reestablishing some sort of baseline health and then fixing all the things that happen, and actually fixing credit is a really big part. Like, that happens in more therapy than you would think. I wonder if there's some sort of way that we could be better linking in experts and folks who might be at risk of suicide with folks who do credit counseling, and folks who, like, collection agencies, things like that. I wonder if, that is just a point of service that we're missing, that there are these places where people are ending out on the road to these financial stressors, and wondering if we know that that's happening, and some of this credit score and actuarial data says we probably do know that. Can we be baking in suicide prevention related to people's financial changes? I mean, do we reach out to banks? Do we reach out to lending agencies? Do we say, if you begin to be worried about clients, this is how you might, do we teach safe talk to collection agencies? Which would not be a bad idea. Well, Bart, you're giving me the funny look, but it's that same idea. You don't like that idea? Pitch something else.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great idea. I think it's a wonderful idea. I think connecting with all of these places that intersect with people in distress, having awareness and education about resources, I think it's an absolutely amazing idea. I'm not sure that debt collectors are particularly maybe they're better folks than
I bet you they have people who say,
although there is a case to be made that people who have passed away do not pay their bills.
There's a case to be made that people who end up in the hospital who are already poor and accrue more debt are less likely to pay bills as well. So I don't know.
I did not say throw everyone in the hospital, because that is not, that's not my particular strategy, but or my preference. But what if we are letting them know, like, how to talk to somebody in crisis and how to consult with suicide prevent, like with your local crisis line. Because I'm guessing, because I do, as part of my job, answer crisis calls, and people mention financial stressors and debt collection a lot. Like, I'm starting to wonder, like, why don't we give them some sort of training about how to do a warm handoff? Because my bet is that they.
Here in Kansas, the crisis center here, we're like a few miles away from one of the biggest call centers that the government uses in the country. And one of the things they do is Medicare and Medicaid signups. And so when you have these enrollment periods, they like boost staffing by 3 or 4-fold. It's nuts. So why not in that boost hire a few mental health professionals who are capable of talking about suicide and suicide intervention, because headquarters gets a lot of those phone calls. They have a protocol that they have to go through, which is fine. But what if the local crisis center isn't able to answer the call at the moment? So like that, and then I love the idea of debt collectors. I love the idea of having somebody like maybe a consultant for payday loans, like a payday loan group on staff that could talk about mental health issues. It's just, I love this idea, but like everything else that we talk about, some of these things aren't scalable.
You're right. Some of these things are not scalable. Some of them are more so. But it's certainly, I'm gonna say, and we're sort of in the sort of end, like we're rolling in the end, and I feel like there's so much we didn't cover. But it seems as if I've gone not as many as some people, but to a few suicide prevention conferences, and I've heard people talk about financial stressors. I actually haven't heard a lot about, well, if we know that financial, reversals in fortune, and in certain areas, the county or the parish in Louisiana that has one of the highest suicide rates has the highest suicide rates in December, contrary to the rest of the country, probably coordinated with layoffs that are seasonal in the petrochemical industry. And so it's one of the wealthier parishes in the state that has layoffs right before Christmas every year. And that is when their suicide rate, white middle-aged men, jumps. So if we know that, like, well, geez, like that might be something that we would want to tell the EAPs, like around layoffs, that'd be something that we would want to talk to the banks about. That would be, things like that, right? Because what we would hope is that those folks might get sort of directed to the door of resources. And Chris is totally right about scaling. Meanwhile, I'm like, can we get some digital data that's a lot more precise? So we aren't just finding everyone in distress, but finding people at risk of immediate harm, and because we could just because that number is a little bit smaller, and could we do something with that? And by the way, that may be possible, but it's also really Orwellian, and it freaks Bart out.
Well,
don't kill me, Bart.
I'm not going to kill anybody. I do think that we have a real problem about where does the social responsibility lie. So to Chris's point, should these folks have more awareness of the resources? Great, but then if they're just dumping these problems that in fact they've created and they're accountable for, that they're profiting from, onto social systems that are already underfunded. And I think the irony of it is that, I hate to stereotype, but I'm gonna, many of these folks are the same folks that want lower taxes, they don't support social safety nets, and yet they want to be able to dump problems they're creating on the social safety net.
I feel like you're engaging in prejudice and discrimination.
I am totally discriminatory.
Against big oil.
Look at this. So here's what we're going to do.
It's kind of hard to feel bad.
To maximize our profit, we're going to lay off a bunch of people right before Christmas because it makes good sense to our bottom line. And so some of them kill themselves. This is business, baby. So there's a lack of social responsibility among businesses and corporations in this country. They're all about squeezing every damn dime of profit they can get out of us. And then once they're done with us, screw you all, good luck to you. And then, by the way, we don't want to pay higher taxes because we'll hire more people if you cut our taxes. And that's just so much crap. So I think
the good people in big box retail are famous for riding the public benefit system to their benefit. So, using the number of hours that people can get and versus recommending their employees, which go apply for food stamps instead of having health insurance.
You sure about that? That seems very un-American.
Pretty well reported, and we don't have a. It's not the kind of system we want. It's the kind of system.
And I would hate to overgeneralize and paint everybody in those situations with such a broad brush. I love Meg Stone was saying we do get warm crisis line from whom we do help that, and then I'm thinking, well, can we do maybe more of that? Do we bake suicide prevention training into the HR training related to all of this stuff? Do we bake suicide prevention training into the training for folks working in banks, stuff like that? Because I think that would make sense. And I can only guess there are a whole lot of people who are dealing with like finances who are like, I didn't do this job to hug anybody, and suddenly I have this person in crisis and it's overwhelming and stressful. So I bet that there are a lot of people in those industries who would feel like it would be very, very merciful if we equipped them with more tools and if we supported them in sort of coming up with some solutions. Probably. But remember, boys and girls, I am the person who'd be like, let's just use the data and find them, which is a little creepy, I admit.
Well, what do? You use the data and you find them, and then what do you do exactly?
I didn't say that I had come up with everything. Step 1, steal underpants. Step 2,
Question mark.
question mark.
Yeah, I just think you end up with a lot of underpants. I'm not sure where you go from there.
That's it. And I've stolen a lot of underpants, and I have a commemorative shirt, and that isn't even an embroidered story. But it would be something we haven't scientifically been able to do. So, before, like if we had identified which stage of cancer you were at, if we had no treatments, that was hard. So it may be that this is sort of one of many parallel solutions that have to be engineered, but one of them is going to have to be finding folks. And then probably, step 2 question mark is going to be some parallel innovations that go with it, if you're asking.
Yeah, and so I guess I come back and I say, well, maybe we're focused on maybe the big data focus or the statistical focus or the predictive focus is backwards. Who gives a crap when we don't have good systems of care in place, when we don't have the necessary resources to actually serve the people who need help, when we've got dysfunction in the very delivery system that we want to then flood people into if we can identify them. Maybe, I'm just thinking off the top of my head, maybe we should focus on making the system better. That would be where my priority would be. But maybe that's just me thinking that we should focus on the most important things first. And maybe there's more important things.
So Dr. Bart Andrews said it first. He's pro-robot therapist. He wants robot therapy everywhere because they don't join unions and you don't have to pay them.
Therapists are almost never in unions.
Currently, but once the robot therapists actually achieve sentience, they may have something to say about whether we have to pay them or not.
I think that they'll take payment. I bet it won't be cash.
And then they'll take over your Keurig and you won't get a decent cup of coffee. But the good news is if you have Keurig and an espresso, you're by robot enabled. This is part of the pre-show. We are at final thoughts, guys. Unbelievable. Hey, everybody, we've only got 2 or 3 minutes left of SPSM. You'll probably need to watch this again because at a third of the time at any given moment, 3 of us were talking at once. Final thoughts, Bart Andrews.
My final thought is I think this is fascinating. I think we need to continue to have these conversations. I know that there's a direct link between folks' financial status and suicide risk, and that these are things that we should be attending to. I think we overvalue the role of mental illness in suicide and completely undervalue and negate the social elements, the financial elements. And I think we'd have a lot more impact if we are more in tune to these societal pressures that drive suicide and we're less focused on mental illness. That's my final point.
Chris Maxwell.
I have 2 final thoughts, but they're super quick. And Tony reminded me of this earlier. One of my favorite sayings is statistics means never having to say you're certain, which I think is really appropriate here. We don't always know what the data says or how to read it or how to apply it. But what I do know is that if we can find a way to actually apply it that results in suicide prevention, that's key. If we have to do some things in between, like boosting our actual systems of care and providing individual training to groups of people or person by person, that's what we have to do until everything else catches up. My other point, and I'm actually stealing one of Sarah Gare's tweets because I thought this was really good. If suicide is multifactorial, then prevention is also multifactorial. Economic justice and opportunity is one of the solutions. I think it's spot on.
Tony Wood.
I'm pro-justice.
The Justice League.
And pro-bunny.
Pro-bunny?
Pro-money.
Pro-money. You're pro-justice and pro-money.
I'm pro-justice money.
Just dollar bills, y'all. Just dollar bills, y'all.
Dollar bills, y'all.
Dollar bills, y'all.
Final thoughts for tonight. We agreed on some things, we didn't agree, or we saw things complexly on others. What nobody disagreed about is that it's very likely that your credit score and social media data correlates that match your credit score are probably strong, robust digital signals that may predict somebody's risk of suicide sort of chronically or even at a point in time. And that's data that we're not actively looking at. It's data that's hard to get. It's data that's hard to do peer-reviewed research on because there are people who do work on that data for private companies within the company, but having researchers get IRB approval, like we managed to find on SPSM a digital signal even more regulated than medical records. Nobody is saying, this is my final thought, nobody's saying it's not a good data signal. It's not a good digital signal. We have digital signals out there that could tell us stuff that we don't know about one of the leading causes of death. So that means we should do something. It's another evening. You've joined us. And it happened. Hang around. There's a lot of tweeting. Everyone likes the 280 characters. I agree. It's really good. Thanks to Sarah for sharing a lot of links to articles. You were totally our PF Anderson tonight, and we're really appreciative. We're so happy to see Amber here. We're so happy to see. Let's do like a romper domper stomper do. We know that Marshman needed to be out tonight. That Marsh, we hope everything's going well. Zing, Noreen, right? Anne Marie. Who else was here, guys?
Tom Cruise.
Jess was here.
Oh, Jess had a comment.
Tom Cruise. Tom Cruise is watching his stuff on the TV.
I know, that was so cool.
Yeah.
That mega weird girl had some great comments. Megan Stone, as always.
Oh my
I'll eat cheese with you any night, Meg Stone.
Youth Mental Health was tweeting up a storm.
John stopped by to just drop a question and then just disappeared on us. Where are you at, John?
Good job, John.
We had all sorts of folks from various chats who were in, and so we had some of our regulars and new people. Thank you so much. Please help us continue the discussion of innovative digital signals that we are not using. And let's make sure that that stays in the conversation. Everyone, have a good evening. Take care.
Peace.
Hi, everybody.